What if the person who just moved in next door knows your wife better than you ever could? Marcus had always believed in clean slates. At 38, with a steady job as a bank manager, a modest home, and a wife he had known for 12 years, life finally felt stable again. Their 6-year-old son, Leo, was the light of his life. After battling through a rough patch of layoffs and emotional exhaustion, moving to a peaceful suburban neighborhood felt like hitting a reset button. The air was quieter here, the trees older, the sidewalks less cracked, even the birdsong sounded sincere. Alice, his wife, had chosen the house. She said she loved the bay window in the kitchen and the way the morning light fell across the dining table. Marcus agreed, mostly because he wanted her to smile more. Lately, that smile had been rare. He chalked it up to stress. New mortgage, new school for Leo, new routines. But when the neighbor next door knocked on the day they moved in, everything began to shift. Ethan was tall, lean, confident, the kind of man whose handshake lingered. He brought over a bottle of wine and offered to help with the boxes. "Anything for new neighbors," he said, flashing a smile that felt just a little too practiced. Alice's face changed the moment she saw him. Not dramatically, but enough. Her smile tightened, her posture stiffened. Marcus noticed. He always noticed the little things. That evening, Ethan invited him over for dinner. His house was tidy in the way a hotel room is, impersonal yet intentional. He cooked, talked a lot, knew about local schools, traffic shortcuts, even where to find the best bagels. But what struck Marcus most was how Ethan looked at Alice. Not with curiosity, but familiarity, the way you'd look at a book you'd read a dozen times and still loved. Alice barely spoke. When she did, her voice carried a softness Marcus hadn't heard in years. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a presence in their lives. He dropped by unannounced, always with some excuse, fixing a pipe, lending a tool, sharing leftovers. He took a liking to Leo, offering to teach him how to kick a soccer ball properly. At first, Marcus was grateful. It felt good to have help. But soon, help turned into intrusion. One afternoon, Marcus came home early from work. The house was quiet. He found Alice and Ethan in the kitchen, standing too close, whispering. Her hand was brushing a crumb off his shirt. They both jolted when Marcus entered. Alice offered a flimsy explanation about garbage collection schedules. Ethan left in a hurry. Marcus didn't confront her, not then. He wasn't ready for the answer he feared might come. Leo adored Ethan. That stung the most. One night, Leo laughed and called Ethan cooler than Dad. It was innocent, childlike, but to Marcus, it felt like a chisel against the foundation of his family. He smiled in response, but inside, a small crack widened. Then came the neighborhood barbecue, a casual event full of burgers, lawn chairs, and cold drinks. It should have been forgettable, but when one of the older neighbors, slightly tipsy and too talkative, turned to Marcus and said, "Isn't it wild that Ethan and your wife used to date back in college?" They were inseparable. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just looked at Alice, who was frozen, holding a paper plate, her eyes locked on his. She smiled, thin and rehearsed. "That was a long time ago," she said, voice barely above a whisper. And then she turned away. That night, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling. The darkness felt heavier than usual. The air, more stale. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't accuse. He simply stared into the pitch black and wondered how long he had been living next to a ghost from her past. Something wasn't right. It was in the silence, in the long pauses, in the way she avoided his gaze whenever Ethan's name came up. He couldn't name the feeling yet, but it had begun to take shape, an ache beneath the skin, a weight in the chest, something that smelled like betrayal but wore the face of a smile. And deep down, Marcus feared that the worst part wasn't that Ethan was more than just a neighbor. It was the terrifying thought that maybe he had never stopped being something to Alice. Marcus had always believed that love was proven not in grand gestures, but in the quiet acts of showing up, every school recital, every scraped knee, every bedtime story read with half-closed eyes. Leo, his 6-year-old boy, had inherited Marcus's careful nature, his love for puzzles, and so Marcus believed. His blood. It wasn't something he ever questioned, until the questions began asking themselves. It started with something innocent, routine. Even, Leo had been having recurring rashes, and their pediatrician recommended a genetic allergy test. Nothing urgent, but the doctor, in passing, asked Marcus if he or Alice had any history of a particular autoimmune condition. Marcus said no, confidently, then paused. Wait, he asked, eyebrows furrowed. What gene triggers this again? Later that night, Marcus lay awake, staring at Leo's sleeping face. There was a coolness to Leo's gray eyes that didn't feel familiar. A curve to his ears. An odd tilt to his gait. He tried to shake it off. Kids are a mix of ancestors, after all, but the thought grew roots. Was it irrational? Was it paranoia? Or was it something deeper? Some unspoken intuition clawing for air. He didn't tell Alice. He didn't want to sound insecure. But the seed had been planted, and it was growing wild in the dark corners of his mind. So he did what any man in his position might do when he needed facts to banish fear. He ordered a paternity test. Just a simple, private test, something he could tuck away and forget if it came back with the expected result. The envelope arrived in a plain package. No dramatic music, no thunder, just the mundane thud of paper against wood as he opened it on the kitchen table. He read the results once. Then again. The words didn't change. Probability of paternity, 0%. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. His fingers went numb. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that single, damning line. Leo wasn't his. Biologically, scientifically, not his. He didn't confront Alice. Not immediately. He couldn't. How could he look her in the eyes and ask the question he wasn't ready to hear answered? Instead, he printed the report and placed it in the back of his desk drawer. Behind bank statements and warranty receipts. Somewhere secret, somewhere sacred. He began watching, not stalking, just observing, her texts, her absences, the way her smile seemed forced when Ethan was around, the way she laughed a little too easily at his jokes. One night, after Leo had gone to bed, he finally asked. His voice was steady, but inside he was crumbling. Alice, he said, I need to know, is Ethan Leo's father? She didn't answer, not right away. She looked at him, then at the floor, as if the truth lived somewhere in the shadows. And then the dam broke. She didn't try to excuse it. She didn't lie. She just cried, not the theatrical sobs of guilt, but the quiet, strangled sounds of someone breaking open. It was one night, she whispered, 7 years ago, you and I were falling apart. I ran into Ethan. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to mean anything. I never told him about Leo. I didn't even know for sure at first. And then, I chose you. I chose us. Marcus felt cold, like all the warmth of his life had just been turned inside out. You chose me to be the father of another man's child, he said, not a question, a statement, a sentence. She nodded slowly. You are his father, in every way that matters. He stood up, walked to the door. The rain had started, fine and cold and merciless. He stepped out without a coat. The test result crumpled in his fist. The paper didn't tear, but his heart did. Outside, the street was empty, silent, but inside Marcus's mind, the quiet was deafening. He didn't know what to do next. He only knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Not his marriage, not his understanding of family, not his place in his own home. And somewhere, in the house next door, Ethan slept soundly. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he, too, was lying awake, counting the years and wondering what might have been. But for Marcus, the question wasn't what might have been. It was what to do now, with the truth burning a hole in his pocket and a son upstairs who still called him Dad. There are monsters that don't hide under beds. But next door, wearing a smile and asking for visitation rights. A week after the storm of truth cracked open his world, Marcus received a letter, not an email, not a message through lawyers, but a handwritten envelope dropped into his mailbox like it belonged there. The writing was sharp, familiar. It was Ethan's. "I think I have a right to see my son." It read, no threats, no demands, just entitlement dressed as civility. Ethan didn't go through the legal system. He went through Marcus, the man whose life he had already invaded like a slow spreading stain. Marcus held the paper with shaking fingers, then quietly slid it into the drawer with the paternity results. Something in him snapped into stillness. Not rage, not sadness, just clarity. If Ethan wanted to stake a claim, Marcus needed to know exactly who he was dealing with. He started with public records. It didn't take long. Ethan had a sealed record in another state, one Marcus could only partially access through contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. There were whispers of disorderly conduct, a DUI arrest, court-mandated rehab. It painted a picture, smudged but menacing, and yet, it wasn't enough, not to stop a custody claim, not to erase blood. So Marcus watched, quietly. He parked down the block and observed Ethan's routines. One afternoon, he saw something chilling. Ethan crouched beside a wounded raccoon in his backyard, whispering, then, not helping, just watching, smiling, like the pain of the animal amused him. He filmed it, shaky hands, distant audio, but it was something. Still, he needed more. He contacted a private investigator. Someone discreet, someone expensive. Over the next few weeks, the pieces fell into place. Ethan had once lived abroad, in a country with looser laws about digital content. There, under a pseudonym, he operated an online forum that had since been shut down by cybercrime authorities. The material he trafficked in wasn't just illegal. It was vile, the kind of evil you don't speak of, lest it infect the air. The PI found archived metadata, VPN logs, and a buried online alias tied to Ethan. Marcus didn't hesitate. He gathered the evidence and drove to his friend Jonah, now working in the local precinct's cybercrime unit. Jonah read the files, then read them again. His face lost all color. "Where did you get this? Does it matter?" Marcus asked. Jonah closed the file. "We'll need to act fast before he disappears." The raid happened 2 days later. Police descended on Ethan's house just before dawn. They found hard drives, encrypted folders, images no human should have to see. And then, buried deep, videos. Some involved animals, some suggested worse. He didn't resist, he didn't speak, he simply smiled like he was expecting them. When the news broke, Alice collapsed, not from fear, from shame, from the unbearable weight of what she had once loved. Marcus didn't file for divorce. Not yet. He wasn't ready to dismantle the legal scaffolding of his family. But he had terms. Alice would sign over full custodial rights. Her name would not appear on new legal documents for Leo. It was not vengeance. It was control of a situation that had spiraled too far. Ethan was sentenced to 12 years. The court barred him from contact with minors for life. His name would be registered. His house emptied. His past finally, violently, exposed. Marcus sat with Leo one afternoon, watching cartoons. The boy leaned against his shoulder, unaware of the storm he had slept through. "Daddy," he said, yawning, "why doesn't Mr. Ethan come over anymore?" Marcus paused, swallowed hard. He had to go away. Where? Somewhere he belongs. Leo nodded and went back to the screen. The innocence of children is a fragile grace. From that day forward, the name Ethan was never spoken in their house. No photographs, no stories, no memories, a shadow locked in the attic of the past, never to be unpacked again. And every year, on Leo's birthday, Marcus told him stories, not of heroes or dragons, but of choices, of the men we choose to become, and the monsters we learn to bury. Some truths, Marcus had come to understand, weren't meant to be shouted or forgotten. They were meant to be carried, quietly, faithfully, like the weight of a name carved into stone. And the heaviest truth he carried was this: he had chosen to stay. Not for Alice, not out of weakness, But for Leo, for the boy who still reached for his hand when crossing the street. For the little voice that still whispered, "Good night, Dad," without knowing the fractures buried beneath that word. Marcus poured every ounce of love he had into Leo. He helped with homework, built tree houses, coached soccer games even when he barely had the energy to speak. But the truth was, love could not erase the image of a DNA result. It could only make peace with it. And peace, Marcus realized, was not forgetting, it was remembering differently. He began to keep a journal, not one of confessions or rage, but a living document for Leo's future. Lessons he wanted to pass down, warnings about the world, reminders that love, even broken, could still protect. He wrote by lamplight after Leo fell asleep, his words silent echoes of the man he tried to be. Alice tried. She apologized, not just once but every day, in gestures small and desperate. She went to therapy. She volunteered at Leo's school. She made dinners, left notes, waited, but Marcus never allowed her back into the sanctuary of fatherhood. The decisions, school, discipline, future dreams, they were his now. Not out of vengeance, but out of instinct. Trust, once shattered, doesn't grow back, it calcifies. Leo, in the meantime, flourished. He was bright, joyful, curious, but sometimes he asked questions. One day, while organizing old photos, he pointed to a picture of the backyard. "Wasn't there a neighbor, the guy who taught me how to spin a soccer ball?" Marcus tensed. He knelt and met Leo's eyes. "Some people are chapters in our past, but not all chapters belong in the book you keep reading." Leo didn't ask again. Each year on Leo's birthday, Marcus would tell a story, not from memory, but from imagination, a fairy tale about a child lost in the woods, and a monster who wore the skin of a man. But in every story, there was always a father, not perfect, not powerful, but unwavering, who stood between the child and the dark. Alice overheard once. She stood outside the door, clutching a tray of cake and drinks that never made it into the room. She didn't interrupt, she just cried, because it was the only truth Marcus would ever let her hear. There was a photo Marcus kept locked away, Ethan. Blurry but unmistakable, and next to it, Leo's updated birth certificate. Clean, unquestionable. Marcus never showed the photo, never mentioned the name. In this house, Ethan had become a ghost exiled from memory. "Dad, do you hate Mom?" Leo asked one evening while washing dishes together. Marcus paused, the sponge frozen mid-scrub. "I was angry," he said slowly, choosing his words like stepping over glass. "Angry enough to leave, but I stayed, because I love you more than I hate anything." Leo dried his hands, then wrapped his arms around his father in a silent, instinctive hug. It said everything words couldn't. In the silence that followed, Marcus felt something shift, not closure, not healing, but the beginning of something that might become both. Sometimes, silence wasn't emptiness, it was grace, and grace, Marcus believed, was how fathers endured. Leo was 22 when he stood in front of his medical school interview panel, wearing a navy suit that fit just a little too tight around the shoulders. He didn't mention the discomfort. He spoke clearly, with a quiet conviction that made the panel lean in. In his application essay, the line that caught everyone's attention wasn't about his grades or his volunteer hours at the hospital. It was the sentence near the end, "My father is not the man who shares my DNA. He is the man who stayed when others walked away." Marcus read that essay days before Leo submitted it. He had found it sitting on the printer, the words still fresh, ink barely dried. He sat on the edge of the bed and read it in the pale morning light. Page after page of his son's heart laid bare. He didn't cry. Marcus had learned to carry emotion in silence. But that night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake with the essay pressed to his chest like a letter from a version of himself he had once hoped to be, and now, somehow, had become. Alice had read it too. She didn't ask Marcus if she could. She simply left him a note. "Thank you for never giving up on him. Even when I gave you every reason to." Time had softened the edges of their wounds. Marcus had never forgotten the betrayal. but he had learned to live beside it, not out of forgiveness, but because Leo's joy was worth more than his own pain. And Alice, she had learned humility in the years since, not through punishment, but through the quiet ache of watching her son flourish in the light of a man she had once nearly destroyed. When the news of Ethan's death reached Marcus, it arrived in a plain letter with no return address. Ethan had died alone in prison. Complications from liver failure. There was no funeral, no body claimed, no name mourned. Marcus didn't tell Leo. Some truths, he believed, were better left buried. He took the envelope, the prison record, and the last photo he'd ever kept of Ethan, and fed them one by one into the fireplace. As the ashes curled upward, Marcus whispered to himself, not with malice, but with finality, "We're done." Leo got married in the spring. The ceremony was simple. White tents in a garden. Strings of soft lights. The smell of jasmine on the breeze. Marcus wore a gray suit. His hair was graying at the temples now. He still moved with the cautious discipline of a man who had once been broken and built himself back piece by piece. Just before the ceremony, Marcus handed Leo a small, framed photograph. It was the very first photo ever taken of the two of them. Leo had been barely 2. In it, he sat on Marcus's lap, eyes wide, hands reaching upward. Marcus's arm was wrapped around him, unsure, yet fiercely protective. Leo held it, blinked twice, and smiled. "This was the day I called you, Dad, wasn't it?" "Yes," Marcus said, his voice quiet. During his wedding speech, Leo didn't speak about love in the way most people did. He didn't thank fate or destiny. He spoke of choice. "I've learned," he said, looking out over the crowd, "that family is not about blood. It's about who shows up. Again and again, even when it's hard. My father chose me, and that choice made me who I am. I don't carry his genes. I carry his legacy." People cried. Some clapped. Others sat in reverent silence. But Marcus, he simply looked at his son with the stillness of a man who had seen storms and survived them, not with bravado, but with resilience. He didn't need to speak. He had already said everything that mattered, not in words, but in years. Because not all children come from love, but every true father begins with a choice. And Marcus had made his. Again and again, until it became the only truth that mattered.